The most controversial issue at the convention was representation in the two houses of Congress. The Virginia plan proposed representation in both Senate and the House of Representatives based strictly on population. Small states were troubled that Madison's scheme of representation would rob them of their power and influence. Roger Sherman, a delegate from the little New England state of Connecticut, stepped forward with a compromise. He proposed that the upper house of Congress, the Senate, consist of 2 members from each state. Thus, in the Senate, all states would be equally represented, regardless of their size. As for the lower house, the House of Representatives, each state would have a number of representatives proportional to the state's population. The delegates heatedly debated Sherman's proposal. Madison viewed the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, as a disaster. He worried that it gave the small states too much power. In the end, the Connecticut plan won out. Madison went along, since, like most of those assembled in Philadelphia, he was a practical man engaged in the practical business of crafting a more workable form of government. Slavery at the Constitutional Convention. No issue threatened the work of the convention more than slavery. In 1787, the United States had a population of nearly 4 million, of which about 700,000 were slaves. 90% of the enslaved population lived south of the Potomac River, making up the unwilling labor force for southern farmers and plantations. After the Revolution, many northern states had outlawed slavery. Their economies did not depend on slave labor, and they saw the contradiction between revolutionary principles and the practice of slavery. All the founders from John Adams and Benjamin Franklin in the North, to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison in the South, understood slavery to be evil. Madison thought it would be wrong to admit in the Constitution the idea there could be slavery in men. They knew that the words "all men are created equal" made the presence of slavery in their midst a great moral contradiction, a contradiction borne out in their own lives, as many of the founders, including Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, owned slaves. Thus, while in theory they were opposed to slavery, in practice they did not know what to do about it. Most of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention expected slavery to die out over time because housing, feeding, and sustaining a growing slave population was becoming increasingly expensive. But that long-term view did little to solve their immediate problem, how to deal with slavery in the Constitution. In part, they dealt with the issue by trying to avoid it. Indeed, the words slavery and slave were never mentioned in the Constitution, but the delegates could not entirely sidestep the issues raised by slavery, and in the end they resorted to compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise. First, there was the issue of the slave trade itself and the ongoing importation of slaves from Africa and the West Indies. Many delegates looked upon the continued buying and selling of slaves as unacceptable in a land that proclaimed all men are created equal. At the very least, some northern delegates argued Americans should start to cut off the supply of slaves and limit the growth of slavery. The southern delegates objected to any provision that would quickly cut off the labor supply on which their economy depended. So the delegates compromised. They agreed that the Congress should have the right to regulate the slave trade, but it would take no action before 1808. The second thorny issue was how to count slaves as part of a state's population. Delegates from southern slaveholding states wanted to count slaves as part of their state's population in order to gain greater representation in the House of Representatives. Some northern delegates objected. New Jersey's William Patterson asked, if slaves are not represented in the states to which they belong, why should they be represented in the general government? Most of the northern states had abolished or were in the process of abolishing slavery. Southerners feared that if slaves were not counted, then free state representation would gain more power in Congress and would use their power to ban slavery. Indeed, they had already banned the expansion of slavery into the Northwest Territory. Northern and southern delegates also argued about how to count slaves for tax purposes. Northerners argued that slaves could count as free persons for tax purposes, which would increase the tax burden of the slave-holding states. Southerners believed that for taxation, slaves should not be counted at all. Such a policy would shift the tax burden to the non-slave holding South. Ultimately, the delegates settled, yet again, on a hard-fought compromise, known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. They agreed that in counting a state's population for purposes of both taxation and representation, each slave would count as 3/5 of a free person. This compromise boosted the slave states' strength in Congress, but also increased their taxable population. At the time, the Three-Fifths Compromise seemed a practical way, perhaps the only way to break the deadlock over slavery and make it possible to pass a new federal constitution. But the compromise would be a source of shame to future generations of Americans. The nation's founding document, the Declaration of Independence, had declared that all men are created equal, but its organizational document, the Constitution, recognized some as more equal than others. We the people. The Constitutional Convention approved most of Madison's original plan. The framers, the members of the Constitutional Convention who shaped the system of government embodied in the new Constitution, finally agreed to adopt a new political framework that included a strengthened federal government with powers separated among three branches. As established by the framers, the bicameral legislative branch, the Congress, makes up the laws. The executive branch, headed by a strong chief executive called the President, implements and enforces the laws. The judicial branch, made up of the Supreme Court and the other federal courts, interprets the laws. To prevent any one branch from getting too much power, the framers devised a system of checks and balances that allows one branch to check or limit the power of another branch. For example, the legislative branch, Congress, can pass a law, but if the chief executive, the President, disapproves of a law, the President can veto it. Congress, however, can then override the President's veto. If two-thirds of the members of both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, vote to approve the law, then the presidential veto is overturned and the law is passed. The new Constitution gave the federal government powers that had previously belonged solely to the states, including the power to impose taxes and regulate interstate trade. And only the federal government could negotiate treaties with foreign nations. While defining which powers belonged to the federal government and which to the states, the framers were careful to emphasize that the new Constitution drew its authority not from the states, but from the American people. The preamble begins by saying not we the states, but instead we the people of the United States do ordain and establish this Constitution. A more important phrase could not have been chosen. It boldly and plainly declared the principle of popular sovereignty. The idea that power rested with the people, and the new federal government derived its powers from the citizenry. At the conclusion of the Philadelphia Convention, as the delegates took turns signing the new Constitution before sending it to the states for ratification, Ben Franklin noted that he had often gazed at the President's chair, from which George Washington presided over weeks of debate. On the high-backed chair was a painting of half a sun. Franklin had often wondered whether the sun was rising or setting. But now at length he told his colleagues, I have the happiness to know that it is rising and not a setting sun. And we will stop here and pick up with the next section in tomorrow's lesson. So let's go back. You have to view the representation compromise online, complete the quick check James Madison, and then of course the checkpoint. So let's go ahead here and take a look. Okay. Learn to the convention. The young nation had serious economic and political problems. Many statesmen thought the United States needed a stronger central government to tackle the growing crisis and deal effectively with its trading partners. The statesmen gathered secretly to tackle the problems. Follow the directions of the student guide. When you have finished the reading assignment, complete the representation compromise. Then finish with the following activity, quick check James Madison. Okay, when you finish the quick check, enter the word you received at the end of the activity in the online checkpoint. Okay, so the representation compromise talks about the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan and just refreshes that information for you. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Yep, let me see, X out of here, and then the quick check James Madison looks like this. Just checking, quizzing some things about the Constitutional Convention and James Madison. And like I said, you'll enter the keyword, you'll get a keyword at the end of that activity, and then you'll complete the checkpoint. So that is all for the 2.09 lesson.